Well, thanks, Chris. Hello, everyone. Nexans, thank you, and Chris, thank you for the invitation to moderate this discussion. As you had already heard, supply chain is a big issue, right? The previous panel first talked about it. And some have really said that supply chain might be the biggest barrier that we're facing in trying to build out offshore wind industry, especially considering at the speed and pace required by our climate crisis and to meet the US offshore wind goals of 30 gigawatts by 2030. And to do this, we need to install 2,100 turbines, 2,100 foundations, and Nexans 6,800 miles of cable to produce the 30 gigawatts of offshore wind electricity in the US. Globally, there is an even increasing appetite for offshore wind, and hence these components. Globally, there are currently not enough manufacturing facilities for large components to meet this growing demand. And it is imperative that we build a supply chain here in the United States to meet this market. But how do you build a supply chain from scratch for the energy transition? What is needed? Is there a workforce available? These are the questions being faced by companies as they seek to build manufacturing here in the US. And on this panel, we are fortunate to have individuals who are actually building those facilities and developing policies and building a supply chain to provide on-the-ground feedback of what needs to be done to build out the supply chain. And so now I'd like to introduce that panel. We have, first I'd like to introduce José Zayas. He's the Executive Vice President of Policy and Programs from ACORE. José is responsible for leading ACORE's policy agenda and implementation of the organization's programs and comprehensive initiatives. José is an avid supporter of clean energy and has over 25 years of experience in the renewable energy and government sectors, including, importantly, experience working at the Department of Energy and its Wind and Water Power Technology Office. So why don't you welcome, hold your applause to the end, and we'll bring José up here now. Next, I'd like to bring up Brett Persons, U.S. Supply Chain Development Manager at Siemens Gamesa. Brett spearheads the localization efforts of Siemens Gamesa's offshore business unit in the United States. And prior to his current position, Brett spent over 10 years leading procurement at Siemens Gamesa Renewable Energy, helping to establish the company's supply chain in the Americas and beyond. Brett, why don't you join us here on the stage? Thank you. Next, I'd like to introduce Patrick Pellerin, President, Marmen. Patrick joined Marmen in 1990, and he has established business relationships with major original equipment manufacturers. His leadership has led and mobilized teams to reach corporate milestones and successfully build a world-class manufacturing organization. Patrick? And last but not least, I'd like to introduce to you Vincent Dessale, Chief Operations Officer and Senior Executive Vice President in charge of the BNT Northern Business Group. Vincent joined Nexans in 2001 and has since held various key supply chain management positions with Nexans. Vincent, you can learn more about these great experts and supply chain manufacturing builders in the program, but I'd really like to just jump in right now and get us started. So here we are. Let's take a step and look at this at the very beginning. We heard some conversation earlier about supply chain and localization on the prior panel. But so what are the trends? We're seeing these trends towards greater localization, both in state policies and in tax credits. It makes sense why elected officials and politicians want to localize the supply chain. But why is this so important to the offshore wind industry and the companies like yours here today? And we'll start right here and work our ways down. So Vincent?
Well, I think, as explained by Brian just before, we look at the mega trend of electrification in the world, and indeed some years back we take this bold decision to build our unit here in the US to be the first manufacturing of cable in US subsea. And in fact, we have been able to do it thanks to, of course, our know-how, the knowledge of the market, but because also we had a strong support from the local authorities, who help us to find the right setup. And in the second step, with the strong collaboration with one of our customers. So I think this ecosystem with, I would say, a first ranking supplier, local authorities, and customer is what we need in order to develop the business. And this type of ecosystem is most likely due to the acceleration of the offshore wind farm in US, the need to be duplicated in order to follow, I would say, this market. If I make a short comparison with Europe, in order to bring the level of gigawatts in Europe, it needs around 3 key players and 3 ecosystem in order to run. So that's basically what we'll have to do in the coming years, I think.
Okay. Well, thank you. And Jose, what are your thoughts on, why is it so important to build out a local supply chain to support the offshore wind industry in this transition, from your perspective?
Like, excuse me, like discussed this afternoon, there's big targets. You mentioned them in the beginning. You got 30 gigawatts by 2030. There's a lot of opportunity. There's a lot of interest. These products are big. We talked a little bit about the scale this afternoon. We're talking about blades that are reaching 100 meters in length. These are enormous structures. So there's an incentive due to logistical considerations and others to have some local content be produced to as close as possible to where they're going to be deployed. In addition to that, we're seeing, of course, a lot of activities through, we alluded them today, through BOEM, the lease blocks, what the states are doing, and so forth. So everything is gravitating towards this kind of ecosystem, and it's critical. We also talked a little bit about jobs and all of the opportunities that are really born and the economic values that are being created by all these. So all these things are coming into play at the right moment and at the right time, which is conducive to creating this ecosystem that we've been discussing this afternoon. I think it's going to continue to move forward.
And Brett, I would ask the same question of you. Thinking about this, Siemens Gamesa has manufacturing facilities globally. You have an announced facility here in the United States. Why is it so important to build this local supply chain?
No, that's a great question. Ross, you mentioned the interest of politicians and the attractiveness of these initiatives to politicians. And it's true, but the reason is because it's attractive to the voters. I mean, the voters want to have local economic development and wealth creation in their communities coming along with the development of offshore wind. So I think, unlike in some other areas of the world, renewable energy is not universally supported in the United States. So finding, a bit of a compromise there. It's not only bringing about the ensuring the future of the planet and the climate, but it's also creating jobs and supporting the local economy is quite important for those voters. So the broad support.
And Patrick, from your perspective, you're also building a facility here 2 hours north or so from here.
Yeah. Well, first of all, for us, it was an easy, not an easy decision, but there was something easier perhaps than most people who have been in wind for 20 years, onshore wind, and then there's that new market coming in the US, potentially huge. It's in our backyard. So it made sense for us to work with our 2 partners there, Port of Albany and Equinor, to get involved. But that's one thing. But if you look, this is for us, but if you look more generally, I think that there will be, especially with what is happening in Europe, which is super big, so there will be a shortage of capacity. So where do we add that new capacity? There is no doubt that adding that capacity in the US reduces the logistic cost, which is non-negligible. That you can say, yes, but the manufacturing cost will be higher, so that's, people have to look at the balance, but still, at least in the manufacturing cost, you don't have that much variation, where in logistics, you can have a huge variation, huge surprises. Thirdly, I would say that with the long-term effect of the war in Ukraine, I'm sure there will be relocation of many activities, most probably in the energy sector. People will be extremely careful who they do business with. I'm sure this is going to happen. So definitely that's a third reason. And a fourth reason, I would say that government are putting a lot of money, and we all want that money to continue and to continue and to continue again. And we cannot just take the money and do whatever we want to do with it. The government wants local content. It's as simple as that. If you want to have more money, you need to listen to the local content, and you need to make it happen.
Yeah, I just want to, I'm going to jump off that last piece here and go a little bit off of what we discussed a little bit. But, we got into this a little bit in the previous panel. They talked a little bit about local content policies and get into local content. What is it, from your perspective, how do you view the U.S. market? Do you think of it as a whole? Do you think of it as individual states? Do you think of it regionally? You know, if you're trying to define, you know, a market in the United States, which of those perspectives do you take, and which would you consider? Would you talk about it as domestic content, regional content, or local content, and which would be preferable for you?
When we looked at it first, there is a reason why we went to New York. It's simply because New York, more than, I would say, equal with New Jersey, they want local content. So we know that they will always take that into consideration. And at that time, until today, it was the state with the highest amount of megawatt. Today with New Jersey at 11,000, they overpassed New York. But we'll see, so it makes sense. And the logistic aspect in the US of moving big parts, monopile, TP, blades, towers from one state to the other is not defined yet. You know, that logistic part, how competitive it will be to take a part, let's say, from New York to ship it to Virginia, New York to Massachusetts. There is still some uncertainty about that. So I think definitively we look at the total East Coast. Okay? But to start with New York, there is no doubt about that. But at the end, we look at it as the total East Coast, but we may end up doing 90% of our stuff for New York.
A broader look. And what about anyone else? Anyone else have any thoughts on where to look, regional, domestic, or otherwise?
Yeah, I mean, you asked the question, do we see, is it one region or is it multiple regions? I mean, I think the answer is it's two main regions, East Coast, West Coast, with a sub-region being the Gulf that can be serviced largely by potentially facilities on the East Coast, although there will be some transportation constraints there. So TBD if the industry builds up also in the Gulf. But to the question of is it regional or is it domestic, I think there also has to be some consideration for domestic. There are currently certain states that support renewable energy and states that do not. And the states that do not are not going to until they see some sort of wealth creation due to that. And it's a little bit of a chicken and egg thing. Hey, will they incentivize it and believe in it, or will they get the jobs first? And I believe that they need to see the money flowing in before they potentially start to support renewable energy.
Yeah, I would just add a couple things. From where I sit today at ACORE, you know, we represent many companies, and my previous job at DOE, we tended to look at things at a national scale. And you look at policies, an important policy that we just saw passed, the Inflation Reduction Act, which I think is a true game changer for offshore wind and many of the renewables for two reasons, and I'll come back to the content piece. One of them, it gives certainty in a decade sense. Many of us who've been around in these industries haven't experienced that in a long time. We've had these starts and stops, which have been very problematic for creation of supply chains, making the decisions to large capital investments that are needed for some of these facilities. And now there are even domestic content considerations within the policies themselves. So it's a really interesting time to talk about domestic context. In the previous panel, we talked a lot about politics as well, and I just want to bring that into the fray. When I was at DOE, it was really interesting to think about offshore wind in relationship to onshore wind, because when we're talking about onshore wind, we're potentially talking about all 50 states. And when we're talking about offshore wind, it's actually, it breaks the union a little bit. I believe to 23 states. I should do my count before I came up here, but it is a subset group. So politically, the landscape's different, and how do we not only encourage that? And now that we see all of the active activities happening in the East Coast with the emergence of what could happen in the Southeast with the moratorium being lifted coming out of the IRA, and potentially now what's going to happen in the West Coast, is a really interesting conversation to be had. But I think in general, the points that were stated in your original question around, these are incredibly large items. I remember being back in the 90s where people thought that a megawatt machine was impossible. And now we're talking about doubling that order of magnitude difference. So the logistics of how do we handle these parts, they're not very easy to pick up too. They're awkward pieces like the blades. There's a lot of considerations to why I think the domestic element is really going to be vibrant and really prominent in the offshore sector.
Well, maybe to add, I think you are looking at the three levels. You need to look at it at national level, regional level, and local level. But the question is about the scale, and the question is about the timing. I mean, when we have started, for example, in Nexans, for sure, it was the beginning of the offshore wind farm development. So we look from a manufacturing unit to be at the national level, because of course, you build a factory for several years. But in the second step, for sure, if in several years the market starts to boom as we expect, most likely we'll have to look to East Coast and West Coast, that's for sure. And after, you have also to think that There's also a part of local content, because even if we are manufacturing right now in South Carolina, when we will do the execution of a project, we'll build local team in the state. And that's why we have opened recently an office in New York. If I make, again, a benchmark, because it has been done in the previous panel with Europe, we have one factory in Norway, but we have execution team in UK, in France, in Germany, in Italy. So that's basically the setup, which is going to grow over the years as a kind of network, part of it being national, part of it being regional, part of it being local. And we'll have also to adapt the second ranking of supplier in the same aspect.
Okay. So you mentioned your facility in South Carolina, and you made the decision with those knowing the various rules to build out and expand your facility in South Carolina. You've made the decision to go ahead in Albany. You have one in Virginia. When you're planning these facilities and trying to move forward, what have been the biggest challenges you've faced in trying to build a manufacturing facility for large-scale components in the United States?
Permits? Permits?
And when you're saying permits, you're talking which permits?
No.
State, federal, or all permits?
No, the main thing is that you have to know the amount of acres that you need, and to be realistic, not the amount of acres that you would like to have, because you won't find that. So that's the first thing. Okay, once you have that, and you have your project, and you have the good partners, but to make it happen, it's if you have major components, so you have to be along a seaway, you touch water, federal government. This is where the problem is. This is where our problem is. Federal government, it's not the state of New York. Federal government, you have to be super patient. And unless you are in that business every year, if you're not in that business every year, you expect a lot of issues, and it will be worse than that. So you have to be super patient. After that, I think you have to look at your cost. You know, if you have been building stuff for 20 years, and over 20 years, it has been more or less the same cost plus inflation rate, it has nothing to do with what it is now. In the last 2 years with COVID, the shortage of people is just, it's another level. So you would be very surprised by what it is. So these are the big things to make it happen. But the land is, if you need 10 acres, there's no problem. But if you need 70 acres, 100 acres, you don't have that many locations, and those locations are perhaps not in the states that you want to do business. So I think that's the first thing, that the magnitude of the land available. Then the permits, be patient. So if you expect that you'll build a shop and in 2 years from that you'll be in operation, that is just not going to happen.
Yeah. It's interesting. Permitting is definitely an interesting perspective and thing to keep in mind. And then also, obviously, yes, of course, in the U.S., in many areas, the coastal land has a value that's been put on people that's not necessarily for manufacturing, right? People want big homes or beachfront property and beaches there, right? Brett, do you have any thoughts on the challenges you all are facing as you're building your facility?
I think Patrick spelled those out quite well. You know, the biggest challenge right now for us is the cost. And not just due to supply chain constraints and, you know, the price of construction going through the roof, price of materials going through the roof, but just even prior to that, the states and the federal government having a true understanding of the cost of constructing these facilities. The components are huge. They have to be outfitted for future technology. The technology is constantly evolving, and that always means that they're getting bigger. So if you want to have, you know, durable facilities, they need to be constructed with those future needs in mind. And it means that the cost is significant. And, you know, going along with that, somebody has to pay that now, or we have to have, you know, the industry can invest, but we have to have visibility on the future pipeline. And we have to have some level of confidence that the volume will continue to come to recapture those investments later on.
And so we talked a little bit about that, and I've mentioned the 3 facilities that are planned and or already constructed here. And you know, the Business Network for Offshore Wind has identified that there are 13 new or expanded facilities that are going to supply either cables, blades, and towers that have been either, again, built or announced in the United States. But our own research has also said that it's just not enough, right? It won't be enough to support what the industry actually needs for this build-out. And Jose, you touched upon this, the IRA, and so I wanted to jump off on that piece, the Inflation Reduction Act. Is the Inflation Reduction Act going to be enough to encourage the further manufacturing we need, or are we going to need more policies, or are we going to need something else?
Yeah, I would just say, the IRA it's one of those policies that is really going to be, in my mind, symbolic to the true movement of all these industries moving forward. Is it enough? It's hard to say, but I think anybody would say that no, it's definitely a great down payment to a lot of the things that I think these industries would need. Everything from what we talked about, from ITCs and PTCs, advanced manufacturing credits for wind turbine specific components, blades, towers, and others. I don't recall seeing cables there, but that's something that I'd like to at least learn a little bit more about as an example. You and I got to chat a little bit prior to this. There are key elements within IRA that I think are enabling and are not there, and that's the ITC for transmission expansion as an example. That is critical. We're talking about all of these assets, not only onshore, offshore, and everything. Transmission is going to be key, and we all recognize that we have an aging infrastructure that is not adequate enough or positioned enough to move the electrons from where we want them to be generated to where we need them. So that's an example of some of the potential shortcomings of the IRA. We're all waiting for Manchin's potential release, which could happen, as I heard, as 6 p.m. today was my intel. There's something will come out discussing that, but my point is that's also a key piece that's missing. So is it enough? I would say no, but from the perspective of certainty, I think it does a lot for ITC and the kinds of investments that are needed when we're talking about billions of dollars to make decisions that need to be made. Many of you may remember, and something that I think is illustrative of why the length of this is so monumental. In 2013, what happened to the wind industry? It went from 12 gigawatts of deployed installed capacity to 2. That really creates havoc to the manufacturing facilities and the certainty that these individuals need to not only make a profit, but to be able to stay around. So those are the kinds of things that need to be prevented, especially in an emerging industry like offshore.
I think, of course, I mean, this proposal are interesting. Is it good enough? That's a big question. But at the end, what do you need? I think I would like to come back to the comment made before. You need to find a location. And that's the most important. It's not so easy. It means poor access. You need to find a competitiveness, an area where you have you can reach competitiveness, where you have manpower, qualified manpower. So that's really the first element. The second element is that you need to have a long-term vision. I mean, you need to see that you have a pipeline in front of you, because if not, of course, you will not invest. And after, when you are starting the execution, at least for us, I mean, building a factory is not so difficult. We are building factories, not each year, but on a regular basis. But what is important is to find the right people, to have the people skill, and make them, let's say, develop their business. So here in US, I mean, you have mechanical engineers, you have electrical engineers, you have run big projects, so you have project manager, you have a contract manager. I mean, all the pieces are there, except that all these different skills have never worked on the offshore business. So our responsibility as a company is to put all these skills together and bring them ready for the development. So for me, I would say the main topic is really people skills. That's a key topic.
Yeah, right.
I would make a comment to challenge a bit the premise and the idea that we need supply coverage for 100% of the demand, right? Because that's always the comment, that more build out is needed to be able to support the industry in the United States. But do we really need to have 100% of the demand for main components coming out of the US? You typically want, and sourcing on all levels, supply diversity. Diversity in location is one of those. So, I mean, if you shut off completely the import supply chain, it's very difficult to turn on later on, or to turn back on later. If you have enough capacity to cover 100% of the demand today, it means if the demand fluctuates, people lose their jobs. So there's a balance there. You want to have local jobs. You don't necessarily need 100% of your components coming from the US.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I will also add something on what Brett just said, and also on the Inflation Reduction Act. The two things: do we need more facilities and the Inflation Reduction Act? And I will use the offshore-onshore comparison, because we're mainly in onshore. In onshore, the market in the US is way, way, way bigger than any facility capacity, if you look at the entire States. Locally, it may be different, you know, down south and things like that, but overall, the market is way, way, way bigger than the production of any facility. In offshore, it may not be the case. You know, let's say a facility, let's say we'll make towers for 2,000 megawatt a year. Okay? If we look at, there is a lot of uncertainty in the market, and the offshore market is something very special. You look at the market, let's say you're new, you look at it, there is a lot of uncertainty. So you say, okay, I'll dig into it and I'll learn more, but the more you learn about it, the more uncertainty there are. So that's a very special market. So, and the thing is that it's highly possible that some years there will be 1,000 megawatt and some years 6,000 megawatt needed. So you may need, so at the moment it will be 1 tower shop hours. So you may, some years need 3 and some years need 3/4. It's, until we know at what level it will stabilize and the permit and until we know that, I think it's slightly difficult to know that. I'm not talking about what Brett just said, that's one thing. And the Inflation Reduction Act, also will use the onshore offshore. The Inflation Reduction Act for manufacturing people is fantastic. Let's face it, there was nothing before. There was nothing before. Right. Sorry for people in cables. Sorry for you guys. For us in towers and blades and Dessale, it's fantastic. That's it. Offshore, onshore. Onshore, we are producing onshore, so we'll get the money right away. You know, so 2023 will benefit. Okay? You need then to say, okay, we want to do more. So there is no permit issue in onshore because everything is on land. You don't touch the water. The problem is the when you touch the water. There's no permit issue on onshore. The permit issue for the developer in onshore is way, way, way smaller than offshore. The size of the component are way smaller, so the construction are way faster. So the Inflation Reduction Act in onshore will have, I think, a very serious impact on the expansion of capacity because of those reasons. You can benefit from it right now. If you look at offshore, you want tomorrow, say, okay, I'm excited, I'll start a shop tomorrow. Minimum 1 year permit, 1.5 years, minimum. If you touch the water, the wharf, and that's the minimum. It's a big facility, 1.5 years construction. Then you need the ramp up to be at full capacity with the shortage of people, 2 years minimum. So you look for 5-6 years where you won't touch the maximum. Now you're in 2028. So you will touch the maximum of the Inflation Reduction in 28, 29, then it's decreasing. And then on top of that, it's maybe tax credit. You can sell your tax credit, but what will be the discount of the tax credit? So when you put all that into effect, it's fantastic. But you have to really look at your numbers and all the uncertainty. But in onshore, it's right now. In offshore, the impact will be more complex to figure out. You have to be more careful in offshore.
Yeah. No, and I think there is another point because we speak about supply chain. So we speak about cables, turbines, towers, foundation, and so on. But you have to integrate the full supply chain because behind this, for cables, for example, you need metals, you need plastics. So it's not only to build the first tier supplier, which is important. You have also to build the second tier, the third tier, and subcontractors which are going to be used in the execution. So I think speaking supply chain, that's what we have to look at. And you have to secure the second tier or the third tier if you want to be successful. And we know with the different crises that we are facing all over the world that sometimes raw material or energy can be an issue. So I think limiting our discussion of supply chain on this first ranking, I would say we minimize the potential risk, I would say.
Yeah, we all like to look at the big and talk about the big shiny objects, right? But you do bring up a very good point, and I'm glad you did, because I want to get into that a little bit more. So you are, a large component manufacturer, and you do deal with, and you work with the tier 2, tier 3s. What specific challenges are the tier 2 and tier 3 or suppliers facing in the United States in coming into and gaining entry into the industry?
I mean, for the cable business, maybe it's a little bit specific. We have the chance to have already an history behind us. We are having as suppliers worldwide companies. So what we have started to do with them already some years back is to see how, as we are also moving in US, as a US producer, what they can do also with us. And some of our suppliers have started already to do exactly like us, to develop product portfolio here in US in order to start to establish a kind of integrated supply chain. And after, the second big part for us, on top of plasticizer, steel, and so on, are of course the metal, the copper or the aluminum. And here we are integrated. We are not so far from here, a big rod mill in Canada, and we are using this rod mill in order to bring non-ferrous metal to our plant. So we are indeed not only putting a factory in the US, but we are also at the same time with our ecosystem of suppliers trying to integrate, to verticalize, if I can say this, all the upstream part. That's significant, that's clear. If not, we will not be able to follow the growth of this market.
Yeah, I mean, Brett, you focus on the localization of the supply chain, right? The people, the businesses that are coming to you, what barriers are they facing, and what things can what barriers are they facing?
If I looked at my voicemail box and my email box, 95% of the people coming to me are global suppliers who are interested in coming to the U.S. I think there's an education gap on the opportunities in the industry with some of the local existing domestic suppliers, number one. I think there's it seems that the states have a greater desire to bring in foreign investment than they do, and at least that's the way it's incentivized in a lot of the solicitations, than they do building up existing local suppliers. But I'm not that often approached by existing local suppliers in the states who are educated and say, I know what you need and here's how I can deliver that to you. Some of them come meet me at a trade show or something and say, yeah, we do this, what can we do for you? But that's not enough, right? If you're coming to trying to sell your product or service, you need to have a market entry plan, you need to know what you can provide. And I think that the gap there needs to be filled by the state economic development entities. And I think the states need to step up, and they're trying, and I talk with them all the time, trying to educate them on some of the things that we buy, what the requirements of our suppliers are, and then they need to bridge that gap between local suppliers and the OEMs and the other tier 1, tier 2 suppliers to develop some opportunities, because they do exist out there. These guys have facilities that are fully depreciated. A lot of them supply aerospace, automotive, other industries with critical quality requirements, same as we would have. So I think it's a bridge just needs to be built. It's being built, but it needs to be built faster.
I was just going to add, and I really like the two words that Brett said. Education is a big gap. I think that's, you look at the example from what Troy from Ørsted said in the previous one, he's sitting in the Gulf and people are saying, we have all these vessels here, so what's the issue? Right? They don't understand the scale or the requirements that are really needed. Qualification, as these individuals try to qualify. It is amazing how much we push what we consider a very cheap basic material, e-glass, for making blades, what we demand on that particular product. And every supplier that may make e-glass to retrofit a boat or update a boat, understanding that the process may look the same, but the requirements are fundamentally different. So there's a big education piece and qualification piece that could be better. I would argue, and maybe it's a question also to the panelists, one of the advantages that Offshore does from a supply chain, recognizing that we have to have more focus on tier 2s and tier 3 suppliers, is at least there is an ecosystem, domestic and globally, that knows how to make wind turbine blades. We're talking about scaling. So there is a place to start from and leverage deeply versus where we were 20 years ago, where we were taking yacht manufacturers and turning them into blade manufacturers. So I think the time's a little bit different, but the education piece and the qualification piece is critical.
So it sounds a little bit like you're talking a little bit about maybe a partnership and a local domestic supplier, tier 2, tier 3 supplier, partnering with the experienced European provider who has played that role before in getting their education. Speaking about partnerships, I want to get a little, just to ask a question. Obviously, Patrick, your project is a part of a partnership. You want to talk a little bit about the process of building a partnership in developing a manufacturing facility for the offshore wind industry? How you went about building your partnership, and how you see, how did you leverage each of your strengths in building and working on the facility?
Okay, we've been looking at putting a facility making towers in the US for a long time. And we have visited all the states, all the land available, and we did all that. And at one point, we realized that rightly or wrongly, we thought that it was going to be quite difficult not to get linked with specific request for quotation. You know, that if you're linked to a request for quotation, and that quotation wins, there is some kind of like an obligation to make it happen. Okay, it's better than to put your facility and then to start looking for work, you know, if automatic. So that was our thinking. And in that specific case, we ended up that New York was going for a big bid. New York is very strong on local content. They had exactly the land that we wanted at the Port of Albany. And then we end up meeting Equinor that really believe in that process, okay? So I think it was a fantastic team, you know, because it's Equinor that bids. It's not, we don't bid. So we ended up with, I think it's a fantastic relationship, and it's exactly like that. But we started with the fact that we need to get, before putting that facility in place, we need to have secure orders. And it was if we can secure the winning, be part of a bid. And that's how we started. And now it's just, I'm just, you know, but the most important thing about that relationship, I cannot even mention, that's confidential. But I would say that at the core of it, those were the main things. But naturally, it's more complex than that. And what's the relationship between the three companies, and what's the involvement of Equinor, which has been, let's say, the key to our partnership.
And you brought out a little bit about some of the factors that you thought about in making the decision to build the facility in the Port of Albany. I'd be curious to have the two additional manufacturing facilities talk a little bit also more about some of those factors that you relied on. So Brett, what were some of the factors that were relied upon in making the decision for the facility to be built in the blade facility in Virginia?
A good question. Certainly, you know, there has to be a desire from the state, right? Because these things come at a cost. There has to be a desire from the state to participate in that investment, to support that investment, and to support the volume suitable or necessary to support and backstop the investment. There has to be, ideally, I mean, the cost of infrastructure development at a greenfield site to build it up to be capable to support, you know, and this has been discussed already, these components are huge and growing, to support loading and unloading these vessels. I mean, you can be talking about going to a piece of green property and paying hundreds of millions of dollars to do that. So if there are existing ports that have existing quays that, you know, have suitable load-bearing capacity and such, that goes a long way toward the economic case. So there was such a suitable site in Virginia that made sense. So that was just another piece of the puzzle that created the suitable environment. So,
and Vincent, you had the facility here.
Yeah, we are a little bit in advance, if I can say this, because we have started the project, or thinking about the project 10 years ago. But again, I think, and I will come back basically to your points, there is two steps. When we launch a project, what do we need? We need to find local support, because indeed you are asking a lot of things to the local authorities to have the permits, so local support and local commitment was a key element. Of course, be in a location where you know you will be competitive versus Europe or versus other potential area in the country. And as I said before, an area where you have university, where you have schools, where you will be able to build and to have a good workforce. So that's really the first element. The second element is really, you call it partnership or alliance, but you need to have a view on your future. Because in this business, and I think it has been expressed in the previous panel, I mean, there is a demand, there is an acceleration of offshore wind farm in US, but we know that there is permits, there is a certain number of process. So sometimes you can be on time, but sometimes you can be a little bit delayed. So you cannot go in such investment without, I would say, an alliance, or I would say to share the risk. At the end, that's really the story. How to share the risk between the different players of the supply chain in order to be sure that if something happens, there will be a kind of help between the different actors. So flexibility and risk management are also two elements that we need to look at in this ecosystem or partnership of alliance, whatever you call it.
Yeah, and absolutely. You know, it took the globe 3 decades to install 30 gigawatts of offshore wind, and we're looking to do it here in the U.S. By 2030. And I won't say 8 years, do it in an 8-year period, because we actually have been spending more time than this 8-year period. We do have a little bit of a history, but we only have 8 years left and 7 turbines installed in the water at this time. This has also been hit on a little bit. Building a supply chain isn't just only about the manufacturing facilities, right? It's also about other infrastructure in place as well. It's about ports. It's been talked about a little bit here. It's about vessels. Does anyone want to get into a little bit about our current vessel supply? Like, do we have enough vessels? What do we need to do in order to make sure there are the vessels to move and install these components?
I can start maybe. I think, well, when you are a cable maker, it's maybe a little bit specific because we are used to say that we are producing cable, but in this business we are doing turnkey. So which means that we have our own vessel, which you can see from time to time on both sides of this room. So when we think about offshore wind farm, we think about solutions. So it's also always factory and laying vessels. So we have built a laying vessel, which is brand new, which is going to support the activity. But indeed, that's right. Otherwise, you have a certain limitation in terms of number of vessels available in the world, especially for this type of installation, direct HVDC, long lengths. So most likely, if we see indeed a significant growth of this market, you were saying before that we'll need probably a second facility somewhere, but most likely you will need, in the coming years, another vessel. Well, it's slightly different for cables. We only need one vessel. You need basically 2-3 years to produce a cable, only a few weeks to install. So you have a different, I would say, balance between manufacturing capacity and installation capacity, but you have to take care of the two indeed.
I think that's a tough question for the folks on stage here to answer. That's not really my area of expertise. But I mean, the short answer to, do we have enough vessels and do we have enough ports and do we have enough existing infrastructure is no. And no, the answer is no. That needs to be built out, and it's happening. We have the first U.S. flagged installation vessel coming, but there will be a need for additional. But you have this hesitation, of course, to invest in these things for the exact reasons we've spoken about already. They require long-term commitment to the industry, and there are while we see a lot of great steps made both in state and federal government, there's still a lot of uncertainty to how this will develop over the next couple of years. As you mentioned, we have very few turbines actually in the water now. We have a lot of permitting challenges ahead of us. We don't yet enjoy universal support amongst the country's politicians and voters, so I think that creates some hesitation. So that means that the cost of those things either needs to be covered now by the taxpayers and ratepayers, or there needs to be more visibility for the companies to be willing to invest and assume they recoup those investments long term.
I want to jump off that part you said there, Brett, about universal support. In the United States, not only are we looking to build an offshore wind industry, its supply chain, create jobs, and other things, and also combat climate change. The industry is also being asked. The industry is also being asked and looked at for helping bring in individuals and communities who have not been a part of the energy sector in the past, and bring local communities into projects and working in manufacturing facilities like they haven't in any other ways in other sectors have not been asked to do in the past. Now, I know José, ACORE has a program that it works with minority and women-owned businesses that you use in order to help bring them into the renewable energy space. You mind giving a little, we need to find some programs to help do this outreach. So
yeah, I'll just talk about it briefly, and glad to talk about it offline if you're interested during the happy hour. We have a program called Accelerate. And its intention is, just like you alluded to, is to really bring companies that really may have a hard time penetrating the market, either by experience or knowledge, or just network capability, and really provide ACORE as a platform where we can bring these companies and introduce them to tier 1 companies and others for the education, for the awareness. We also have a mentor program, and there's a lot of facets that we try to do to at least enhance, or in essence, like the name says, accelerate their adoption into this industry, because what we have found throughout every single company in our portfolio is that they have a lot to offer. They have a lot to offer in ideas and in thoughts that maybe we haven't considered, and a lot to offer in terms of technology that maybe we didn't even know about. So the whole motivation for us as an organization is to really try to identify these companies and really provide them a platform so they can engage and have robust discussions. And what we're finding is a lot of maybe things that we didn't even imagine in the beginning. Now they're working together, and they're creating a bigger part that they couldn't do on their own. And they're doing really impactful things either in their community or entering the market. So we have this smattering of success stories in a rather short amount of time, which we're really proud of and glad to talk about it more.
Great.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. And we are here in Climate Week, and this is Nexans Climate Day. And so I'd be remiss about asking a question about a sustainable and low carbon, decarbonized supply chain. And I'm gonna just specifically ask this question to you, Vincent. I understand there are companies, project developers, and others that have these in corporate policies seeking to move to a 100% carbon neutral supply chain. Your other companies have different sustainability policies. Can you talk a little bit about any policies that Nexans has itself, and your thoughts on meeting? You're a supplier to those companies that have that policy in place. How do you envision meeting those goals and those requirements from corporate policies of the project developers?
I think first, it's not only goals, it's a commitment. I mean, we have taken the commitment to be carbon neutral at Nexans in 2030, so we are working since now several years on these commitments. And basically, if we go directly to the offshore wind farm, what does it mean when we are operating in this sector? So you have different streams to answer to this ambition. Of course, you have our production assets, could be the installation vessel or manufacturing. And here we are working much more, I would say, about a certain number of technical elements to reduce the consumption. So it's about consumption reduction, efficiency in the management of energy, and we have several programs running. The second element is, of course, to work with our suppliers in order to integrate the full scope of the carbon neutrality, and most of our suppliers are also committed to be carbon neutral either 2030 or 2050 for some of them. And we are also trying to develop with our R&D team materials which are, I would say, having a lower content. So this is now we have solution for aluminium, for example, with lower carbon content. We have solution also with copper, because we are doing recycling of the copper, so we are reducing the CO2 impact. We are also working to find solution to have, as I said, local sourcing of supplier to reduce the transport. So it's again the analysis of the full supply chain. And indeed, we have our own commitment. We try to have commitment with our supplier. And to be crystal clear, we are currently signing agreement with all our suppliers in order to be sure that they are going to work with us in this ecosystem again to reach the ambition in terms of CO2. And if the supplier does not have this commitment, we have done it with some of them in some areas, we stop the collaboration. So it's not only window dressing, it's really reality, engagement, commitment, but it requires indeed a lot of works in order to be done. Again, as I said, the different stream, efficiency consumption, using renewable energy, and work with the supplier in order to integrate them in the overall application.
And expanding that a little bit, just beyond the suppliers, what is the role of policymakers and elected officials and local economic development agencies in helping to assist you in those efforts of moving your supply chain to a carbon neutral supply chain?
You know, the best element is, of course, to have access to renewable energy. So I would say it's a kind of loop, but more you will have indeed offshore wind farm energy available, and clearly we'll source locally this energy. And that's a big component indeed to reduce the CO2 emission, that's for sure.
So making sure we hit that 30 gigawatt target would be a really important piece to that, right?
Absolutely.
Okay, I hope you're all listening, policymakers back home on that. I just wanted to turn now quickly before I jumped. I had a few more questions for you, but I wanted to see if there's any questions here in the audience. We have the opportunity here to ask people who are actually building some manufacturing facilities in the United States some questions about how they're doing it and what they're doing. Is there anyone here that has a question for our panel? Yes, I see someone in the back over there.
What are the biggest risks that you see for your current supply chain plans that you have to address the shortfall right now?
Yeah, I'll take that one. I think there's a lot going on globally, right? There's a recession fears. There's certainly some sort of economic crisis happening right now. It's an energy crisis in Europe, and the ensuing currency complications there. There's the unknowns around the Russia-Ukraine situation. All of that has, reverberates throughout the supply chain globally, and it's very difficult for us to quantify those risks. And everyone in the supply chain, from ratepayers on back, are trying to decide where that risk is absorbed. Okay, of course the states are willing to participate in it to some degree, but they want the other industry participants throughout the supply chain to accept some of that risk as well. So I mean that's number one, and I think number two is, as I've mentioned a couple of times up here, the uncertainties around how the industry continues to develop and be supported in the United States. The uncertainty, and I have not mentioned this, around how much of an emphasis on local content the states continue to maintain. We have seen in other countries globally where there's a major emphasis on local content. Everybody rushes in, builds facilities, and the country says, you know what, I'd rather have cheap wind now. And those facilities are then sitting there, they go empty. So those are the biggest ones I can see right now. There's probably something important I'm not thinking about, so.
No, I just want to use the example that I used before to really illuminate what Brett just said. When I mentioned the example, what happened to the land-based industry, and I really, my dearest hopes, having been a big offshore wind aficionado for a long time, this doesn't happen. When the 2013 event happened for land-based, it wasn't until 2020 that the capacity equaled what we had in 2012. So if those facilities go dormant for considerations like the one Brett, the confidence to want to reinvest and bring it back online is a huge hurdle, if almost impossible. So those are the considerations. Just wanted to.
Yeah, and the cost. I mean, when you idle a facility that's efficient, you turn it back on. You're years until you hit that same level of efficiency, and the rate somebody has to pay that cost, absolutely. Right? So,
yeah. So if I just may, just moderator privilege right here. I do think that the uncertainty and one of the things that you haven't touched upon is the fact that when you looked at something like you talked about onshore wind, you had the tax credits that were starting and stopping, and they were starting and stopping, which created an ebb and flow with the industry. And so right now we have an administration in the United States that is all in on offshore wind. And however, we have an election cycle in this country where every 4 years may have a new administration that can come in. So that also obviously is a risk because you don't know what the next administration's position yet is going to be on offshore wind. So that poses a political risk.
Sir, if I may, certainly does. But I think, and maybe I should say I hope, what the IRA bill does is really break that cycle marriage that was in the past. If you were to see the past, and if you were just to plot, just Google wind capacity deployment by years in the U.S., you would definitely see that political cycle very prominent in that ups and downs cycle that are very, very disruptive. I'm going to use the right word now, which I think it's hope. I think the IRA being now 10 years, given certainty to 2025 for the offshore specific, and then going to a tech neutral, rules to be, of course, figured out through Treasury, and that's something that we're really focused on. That mismatch within the political cycle, it's going to be really interesting, and my hope is that it'll dampen some of those uncertainties that are just created intrinsically by that 4-year cycle that we have in our political system.
Yeah, No, and I think we have to come back to the introduction of this climate day at the end. We have no choice. So maybe we'll have some hurdles because you will have during some years a change of politics, or you may have some some activity a little bit slower because permits and things like that. But at the end, we have no choice. So, you know, in Europe, if I compare where you said in your introduction that we have a bigger capacity, but if you look back, at the beginning also it was not so easy. We have hurdles for permits, and we still have in some countries some difficulties, but the mega trend is there. So, okay, you may have maybe some slowdown, some difficulties, but I don't see other options. Could be for offshore wind farm, could be for solar, or other type of renewables. But at the end, globally, as inhabitants of this planet, we have no choice.
I was just going to make one final point there that a very smart guy that I know mentioned to me just earlier today the importance of engaging red states in some of the supply chain development and to allow them to share in some of the benefit. And if we're creating jobs in red states, it's going to be much less attractive for the faucet to be turned off later on. So.
Yeah. That's great. Yeah, that's what you're seeing in all renewable technologies right now. So yeah, thank you for that.
Hi, Nate Titai from Equinor. Really great panel. Thanks so much for your thoughts. Just a topic, you know, I think it touches upon something that you all hit on in some way is the just transition and thinking about workers that can be in the supply chain. Obviously, looking at opportunities for people that have worked in the supply chain in the oil and gas industry, for example, or in the coal industry. A lot of discussion about how do we ensure kind of gainful employment in the supply chains for workers in the transition. Of course, there are geographic components there. There are different, the offshore wind industry, as we've talked about. Of course, in the Northeast here, workers for some of these industries are in different parts of the country. And it's not just easy for people to pick up and move and find new gainful opportunities. But how do you relate to the, if you will, the workers in the just transition and think about how to leverage existing supply chains for, you know, similarly situated industries and bring them into the fold? How do you see those discussions going? Thanks.
The workers issue is a very important issue. There's a bad thing in the US, there's a good thing. The bad thing is that of all the developed countries, I think there is less than 9% people working in manufacturing. Percentage extremely low in the US compared to any other country. But the US is a big country, so in absolute amount, it's still a lot of people. That's a good thing. If you look, because I've visited a lot of facilities in Europe where the dynamics is totally different. You visit a shop in Belgium, in Denmark, in Germany, it's not Germans that work in the shop. Greek people, Polish people, a lot of people from former Eastern Europe where manufacturing was really, really strong. So they have access to that pool of people, which is not the case in the US. Because if you go in a tower shop in those countries, it's not the native people that work in those countries, not at all. So that's the difference, that this is something that we don't have in the US. But the key thing is to work with schools. Government money is good, but work yourself, do your stuff. Work with schools and make it attractive. Make your company attractive. And the good thing about offshore wind is that because offshore wind will be part of the solution to mitigate the climate change, is that you can give a meaning to your people. If you work on that, you are part of the solution to that big crisis. At least you give them a meaning. So if their job has a meaning, and if your company is attractive, it's not the government money that will solve that. Yeah, you have to do that yourself. But still, it's a huge issue. See, because the United States for manufacturing, there are huge challenges. Most people, young guys, they are not there. They are not there. But you were talking about communities that are not in good shape. Where we're located, next to us, next to our facility, there is a community which is not in good shape. But we will attract them with good jobs, more than meaning. They want good jobs. We will add the meaning to that. We will add the quality of the company to that. But they are looking for good jobs. So you still have too many of those communities in the States. That's a good pool of resource.
But I think it's, as we said, it's a ramping up business. It's a new technology, at least here in US. So you don't have many options. You have, as you said, to work with schools, university around in your perimeter in order step by step to build the competencies. You have also to work to look on the what I would call adjacent type of business. I mean, it's what you said. We are somehow there is an experience in oil and gas industry in US, and for sure that's where you will find in our business project manager, expertise in mechanical engineer, and so on. So you look to the different sectors. We are also, of course, doing a lot of trainings internally. We are trying to duplicate what we know from Europe and make extensive training our people. And I think it's what you say. You have also to offer attractive job to the people in order to attract them in our companies. And I would say that's why we are. That's not the main reason why we have chosen Charleston, South Carolina, because it's a quite attractive area for US citizens. But it's part also of the story. I mean, when we chose Charleston some years back, we thought about that, saying, okay, it's also a nice area to attract people. And we have people making quite a lot of miles in order to join the Charleston and South Carolina area.
Any other questions in the audience? Oh, yeah.
So this is Teddy Mulfelder from Equinor. I'm getting a lot of questions now from Equinor. How do you see, maybe if you look 10, 15 years from now, how do you see the landscape of the US supply chain looking? How big does it actually get? And then another question is around, is this a US supply chain for the US, or is this a US supply chain that can realistically sort of compete on market levels internationally?
I don't want to put anyone on the spot, and I'm not going to, but there is a company that's already built and manufactured the cables and then exported it to a wind farm in Scotland.
No, I think I think your question is quite interesting, because at the end, of course, we are here in order to build facilities, experience to deliver the US market, but indeed our first production has been for UK. And I think there is three reasons which are important, and we don't have to think only US. The first point is that it's good for our customers to know that there is backup solution. It means today we are the only one able to produce subsea cable in US. To know for our customer that we have another possibility in Europe, I think it's something very important. We have to reduce the risk for our customers. So that's the first element. I think the second element is that the first project in US are, I would say, not small, but they are average size of offshore wind farm. The next generation will be much bigger. And who knows, maybe you will need 2 facilities to run at the same time on the same project in order to reduce the overall lead time to install the offshore wind farm. And we have seen that already in some interconnection in Europe, where we have run 2 facilities at the same time in order to reduce the overall time, because like this, we reduce the cost of the project. So, I mean, you have to think about that. And the last element, we spoke about it, in this ramp-up phase, we know that sometimes you can have some holes, if I can say this, in the pipeline, and to be flexible and be able to export, that's also important. So you have these 3 aspects from my perspective, which are important to think not only local, but to think a little bit broadly.
I'll just add, you know, where Ross started today, Teddy, and sharing some big numbers. If we just use the administration's objectives just as an anchor, right, 30 gigawatts by 2030, some big numbers, 2,000 turbines, 6,800 miles of cables, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We know we need a little bit of everything. So if in the time scale that you alluded to, you know, I would hope that we have a robust supply chain that not only meets our domestic demands, you know, to the point, the second question that you asked specifically, what can we maybe consider even exporting? You know, the challenge with that question is, in particular, at least to offshore wind, is how do you take into account the logistical considerations that are borne by some of these articles, right? Not all of them are created equal from an exportability. I don't even know if that's a word, but I'm going to use it right now. But so I think that the opportunity is, yes, I think there's going to be areas where we can compete both by global demand, just pure need for products, and competitiveness as we spool up our capabilities here. My concern, and this is a concern that I always had at DOE, as we look at how things have been occurring, and especially in the offshore wind sector, you have these state pushes and these companies coming online through the lease process and so forth, is how do we ramp up our supply chain as effectively and as efficiently as possible? How do we go into a potential steel manufacturer as a cohort of companies saying, hey, let me give you some certainty in volumes instead of fragmenting it, because I think there has to be some efficiencies that are born both to create the certainty in others. And those are the things that I've always been worried about and how this system has evolved. I may be wrong. I've been out of the agency for a little bit now, but those are the things that I'm really curious how they'll manifest themselves in the short time scale. But I think if we can get past that hump, leverage the certainty that's created by policies, administration goals, whatever it may be, momentum, and create that foundation and preserve it, I think that the opportunity space is there. That hump is what I've always struggled with.
I think the U.S. is not a manufacturing economy. I mean, the goal here is to have suitable manufacturing to support part of the demand of the industry locally. But I mean, the cost driver that would make us competitive for exports would mean that our cost of labor was lower. And if our cost of labor is lower than other countries, we have a problem. This isn't something really that I think we'd be working toward as a country, just on a macroeconomic scale. I do think that, you know, this first wave of main component facilities, nacelle facilities, tower facilities, and to a lesser degree blade facilities, will serve as anchors to a developing supply ecosystem around them, because if it doesn't make sense today, if it's a challenge to build components that can be used locally, it's a huge chasm to produce components that can then be shipped to main component facilities in other countries. So the first step is to get the main component facilities and to train local workers and to procure services locally. Then comes building up of that second tier, I call second tier from my chair, supply chain, component suppliers, and on up the supply chain to some of the other component suppliers that can deliver to those facilities.
Yeah, I think you raised a good point there, Brett. You know, Teddy, it's not, you know, we're only talking about a small piece of the supply chain here. That, as you well know, the supply chain is more than just the manufacturing facilities, and there are other aspects, services as well, and things. What we should do is look at the U.S. economy as a whole and see where the U.S. has its strengths, like IT. You know, we have Silicon Valley out of the West Coast. We have, you know, strengths in cybersecurity and defense and things of that nature, and which are all important integral pieces of the offshore wind supply chain. So we can look for those companies within the U.S. that do those things well, and then give them the offshore wind education and get them into the offshore wind supply chain, and then look to export those talents from there.
And just to add to that, and also looking at facilities that have excess capacity and balancing supply and demand in the country. The question was asked earlier about just transition. There are factories out there that are fully depreciated, that have a lot of machinery that's sitting idle, that have people in the community that need jobs. Rather than building a bunch of new buildings, essentially, and building additional capacity, which creates more challenges for those businesses, looking at, you know, again, and I said it earlier, having the states help us to build that bridge between the manufacturers, the OEMs and the developers and the local manufacturing entities to help with that supply and demand analysis.
If I may just add, maybe again specific to offshore wind, that at least I'm curious your thought, Brett, since you were commenting as well. When I look at the U.S., as you well alluded to, we've lost a lot of our manufacturing prowess, I would argue, and we have some intrinsic areas that we are really good at today. What always has made offshore wind interesting in my mind, especially when I was in the federal government, is we're not going to compete on pure just labor, but these products intrinsically carry another variable, which is just the logistics to move it, which in essence becomes a suppressor to labor. Right, because it's at the end of the day, is how much is it going to cost me to get products from A to B? And it makes it really interesting, especially when you compare it to other renewable industries like solar, for example. As we are trying to figure out how we compete in solar, all the panels kind of look the same. We can put 100 of them in a shipping container. So our ability to compete on the logistics game and the labor becomes a little bit more complex in comparison to moving a wind turbine blade. Mm-hmm. So that's what at least has always given me at least true confidence that we can have at least a robust, it won't fulfill all domestic supply chain for sectors like offshore wind, just because that transportation component is going to suppress our inability to compete on a pure labor perspective.
It's easier with larger components.
Yes, for those
It's easier
components.
with larger components. When you get into the smaller, you know, tier 2, tier 3 components, then that's when they become more exposed to market forces from imports.
So I'm going to push back a little bit. I have, as the business network for offshore wind, we have members that are from labor unions, and they're in my ears all the time, and they push back on that piece there when it comes to the labor. And, you know, and things that I hear in response is, well, yes, maybe cost dynamics are different, but when you look more into the value of the labor, you get the training and the experience and the other aspects, or other pieces and components of the labor and workforce that you may not have in Europe that maybe make, while one may be a lower cost supplier, there may be more value and less error and better work and more efficient work products with the other. So I just want to push back on that piece and see, you know, how would you factor that in?
No, I agree. And listen, I'm just a little bit out of date, but I think these are themes that apply, right? I think that Europe has shown that they can make products themselves for their own services and be competitive. And I would argue that their labor wages is not out of line compared to the US labor wages. I may be wrong, but I would assume they're fairly comparable. Again, I may be wrong there. So I agree with you. I think that I think the opportunity for us to have a robust domestic supply chain is real for the considerations that we said. I think that we can revitalize in certain areas a robust manufacturing presence. Is it going to fulfill all of our orders? I think Brett's right. I don't think it'll ever happen in that sense.
It's going to come at a cost. And I didn't know if this question was going to come up because I wanted to make this comment that in some cases, continual support of this domestic manufacturing may require indefinite subsidy, and that's okay, right? I mean, if you don't have to have component manufacturing in the US that is nakedly competitive all on its own. It all comes down to cost per job per year. And if the amount of money that you're paying a worker, if you're paying $20,000 or $40,000 a year to support a worker who's making $80,000 and spending that $80,000 in the local economy, it's a hell of an investment for the state, right? It's not a handout in any way. It's an investment in a blue-collar workforce which needs jobs in the United States. If we didn't have that, and we have that in many, many, many industries in different forms, there's subsidization all over the place. If we didn't have that, we would have a blue-collar workforce with no job opportunities, and our manufacturing capabilities would crumble, and that wouldn't be good. So,
I would add something because the question that Teddy was asking was about what about 10 years from now, and what Vincent said was that earlier he said that it needs to happen, or it needs to happen. Okay, I think it depends a lot. Also, the worker issue is one thing, but I think that the size of the market in the U.S. plus what I've said earlier at the beginning, the political aspect of the war in Ukraine. I think people totally underestimate that, and which is a huge mistake. There will be a relocalization of factories. You know, if we look at what is happening with the computer chip, we should all be scared to death about what is happening. That can disrupt the economy tomorrow, anytime. And on the energy, we have a lot of people that do the same thing as we do in Europe, transition piece, monopiles, things like that. And they just said that with the war in Europe, at the beginning, it was disaster for them because the price of steel just went to the roof. But now it's bonanza, you know, because there is a relocation of the production of electricity in Europe. And things, last week I was told that one guy, he needed a permit usually 2 years in Germany. 2 weeks now. 2 weeks. 2 weeks you have your permit for serious work. And again, the price are to the roof, company will invest like crazy, the demand. And to assume that this is going to the roof in Europe and in the US, it will be business as usual. And we won't, because in onshore, the problem with nothing is being exported in onshore. The big competition is Asia. Asia is coming in my product, you know. Asia is coming in full speed. This is where the competition is. But if there is a reorganization in the political aspect with respect to Asia and China and things like that, that will change the game. That will be the main drive. I believe, if we look at 10 years from now, that should be one of the big drivers, the relocation. And the cost will be the cost, and the people will adjust. and we'll pay $50 per hour to get a welder because that's what we'll need then, and this is what will happen. I think to underestimate that part is a big mistake.
Oh, and I think it's what you said also. We are going to do here in US what we have done in Europe in basically 1/3 of the time. So when you look back in Europe 40 years ago, I mean, there were 1 or 2 players, very small, trying to build the supply chain. Now it's a very robust and comprehensive system with plenty of companies, big players, starting from the raw material, the components, the manufacturing unit, the installation, the subsea activities. So the scale-up of the market in US will push us to do that. And of course, there will be probably part of it which will be import. But the size of the market by itself will generate the growth of the market. So the only question is indeed the speed of the growth. Is it going to be, I would say, high speed with a lot of projects? But if you see the number of projects coming, I don't see how in 3 or 5 years there will be a consistent overall ecosystem on the offshore wind farm in US. We have no choice. And with all what you say also about the overall environment, there will be a need to do that. And indeed, what we have seen also in Europe is that we have been more and more efficient. I mean, we are able to reduce the cost, to work on new design, new solution, find solution to reduce the percentage of labor in the overall solution. So we should be able to do the same here, in the same manner, and normally in a speedy way.
I was just about to give you all the opportunity to say a parting word as we wrap up on time here today, but I think, you've kind of framed it really well.
And we're out of time.
And we're out of time. But before we go, I'd like you all to please join me in a round of applause for our panelists there today.